Well, good evening. It's very good to have you all here, and I think it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. James Head. I've known Jim for a good number of years. Jim got his undergraduate degree at Washington Lee in Virginia, and then went on to get his Ph.D. at Brown University. And he comes to us from Brown University today. But I first met Jim when he was working on the Apollo program, because when he graduated, he went right into a job at NASA headquarters working on system analysis for Apollo. And Jim played a major role in selecting the landing sites that we landed on for the moon, and also played a major role in laying out the traverses that the astronauts took after landing, and also worked very hard on the investigations and the experiments that we would be doing on the lunar surface, and did receive the Exceptional Scientific Achievement Medal for his work on Apollo 15. He was a major contributor for the crew training of all the crews that did the subsequent missions after the initial landing. So he played a major role in that program, and then went on to be the interim director of the Lunar Science Institute and became involved in the analysis of the lunar samples, and has continued to play a major role in lunar and planetary science. He was involved in the Viking program that landed on Mars in '76, and subsequently involved in Galileo and the Magellan missions, and received a medal from NASA, a Public Service Award, for his work on that. Was involved in the shuttle imaging radar, has been involved in many NASA committees over the years, has many honors. It would take probably all this evening to go through and tell you all the honors he's received. But Jim also, I think, was a pioneer in getting involved in working in the international arena with our Russian colleagues, and has been involved with the Russians on lunar and planetary science for the last 35 years, and is going to speak to us this evening about that. But I think over and above all his other work, I think the great thing that Jim has done is mentor and supervise a tremendous number of students over the years, both for their master's degrees as well as their Ph.D. degrees. He comes to us this week after a very successful lunar and planetary science conference up in the Woodlands, and Jim said he had brought down 12 students to that conference. That conference has been going on ever since we first landed on the moon and got into the analysis of the lunar samples. And it was very gratifying to hear Jim talk about this conference, because a tremendous number of young people were there. So without any further ado, let me present Jim Head.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I've known George for years, and it's the Apollo days were just fantastic. Having that be my first job was something, you know, one can only dream of, being in the right place at the right time. And thank you for all the accolades. I think, you know, when you look back on your career, as I just did as listening to George, my wife Ann and I were in India recently, and I think I received the most gratifying accolade that I've ever received in my life. An Indian scientist was trying to introduce me to a member of the press, of the local press in this town we were in India, and he kept trying to explain what I did, and he mentioned the astronaut training, and the guy just wasn't getting it. You should talk to this guy. He's done this, and, you know, oh, what, yeah, okay. And the guy was he's the Michael Jackson of lunar geology. And wow! So the guy was just completely hooked after that. So I have to put that on my resume somehow. But anyway, we've had a wonderful, wonderful moonwalk. That's good. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. Maybe that was the connection. You know, I used to be a rocket scientist, but I can put it. So it's really been an amazing time in terms of the history of interaction with international partners. And George, of course, has been just fundamental in his work on the International Space Station, and really bringing NASA into a realm where international cooperation and participation has just been the sign and signal of the day. I want to tell you a little bit about our history with interacting with the Soviet Union and with Russia now. And the idea is to give you a little bit of an idea how I came to be involved in this from my own personal point of view, and also what it meant, and then where do we go from here? What are the lessons here, and where do we go? What kinds of things do we learn interacting in a rather unusual time from the political point of view, because it was the evil empire. I mean, and so interacting with the Soviet Union, why would I even want to do that? And where do we go from here? So I wanted to just share with you a few slides, particularly some personal aspects of this, which, in fact, to talk a little bit about some of these points. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I'm from Virginia, but most of the times I lived in Washington, D.C., and it was in the 1950s when, of course, there was a huge communist phobia at that time, as you can see from some of these things. Just remarkable. I mean, it was quite fascinating, and there was no internet at the time, of course, so for me the internet was stamp collecting. You know, I would get boxes of stamps from relatives who were around the world, or my father would buy me this box of stamps, and I'd sit there and sort them out and try to actually understand what these different countries meant and where they were. I had one of those old globes, and I could put the pictures together and try to match the stamps up, etc. The other thing that my parents bought me, I remember $50, is like $1 million at the time, a Hallicrafter's shortwave radio. And I used to sit and, listen to different places and try to find different radio stations to listen to and try to understand what language they were speaking. Sometimes it was in the U.S. and I didn't even understand the language. Other times it was real foreign language and I had to kind of decipher that. And it was interesting that I would be able to get Radio Moscow. And this was in Washington, D.C. at the time. And of course, what I didn't realize, it was great. Oh, this is really great. You can really hear this well. And I marveled a while at why the signal was so good. And when I looked on the globe and found that Moscow was halfway around the planet. And so this is the beginning of dawning on me that something unusual was going on. This wasn't a regular radio station, okay? There was more to the whole picture than just actually listening to a thing that far, but it was actually being beamed to us. So that was kind of interesting. And then, of course, not too long after that, Sputnik Launch. And this was pretty amazing from the point of view. Those of you who will, I'm not sure many of you were around at this time, but if you listen to that beep, 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 only just a couple, okay, this signal just stunned the planet. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Nobody had ever really thought much about this, certainly not the people on the street. And indeed, when they did, it was a big threat, a huge threat, as you probably know. And so one of the things that we thought about at the time then was, what's going on here? What's going on? The space race, all this sort of thing, the missile gap, all these kind of things were happening. And if you haven't already seen October Sky, this is a movie that is just a wonderful portrayal of what it was like at that time. So even if you've seen it, see it again. It's really, it grows on you. It's incredible. So I was listening to Radio Moscow at the time, and I remember sitting on the back porch watching Sputnik go overhead. I got my little radio out, and I would occasionally catch the signals from that. And again, those signals were just unbelievable. But I couldn't figure out what time the thing would come over, so I had to search a lot, and it was very frustrating. And yet Radio Moscow told me, if you want to know when Sputnik is going to come over your home so that you can tune into it, just send a letter to Radio Moscow, USSR, and we'll send you a booklet that tells you when it's going to come over. And I thought, wow, that's for me. I saved up my allowance, bought all the stamps, put them on there. Radio Moscow, USSR, that's all you needed. And off it went, and I was just totally excited. Every day I'd come home from school, and, just, is it there yet? We had a little table that the mail was put on, and is it there yet? And finally, after a couple of months, I received the reply. It was a wonderful, large envelope, which had a whole series of these beautiful Russian space stamps. I looked and my God, this is incredible. Picked it up. I knew the book was in there. And I looked up, and there's my aunt. This was the day I became aware that my aunt worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. So this was a big surprise to me, and it made sense because in years before, we would go to the beach. My mother's sister, we would go to the beach, and she would ask me if I could sit under the boardwalk with her and do flashcards. Oh, sure, why not? So we'd do flashcards, and it'd be Chinese characters and symbols like tank, bridge, plane, army unit, and stuff like this. And it's like she was actually preparing for the Chinese to come across the Yalu River in the Korean War, because she was actually a cartographer. She wasn't in. She was in the overt, not covert, part of the CIA. So this was really interesting to me, and it's finally made sense why all this was going on. So that was my lesson. She was sure that I was never going to get a federal job, forever because of this. And I kept getting these books from her for my birthday. One of them is What We Must Know About Communism by Harry and Bonara Overstreet. I'll never forget that for some bizarre reason. And it was an excellent book, actually, because it talked all about, these, I was a communist for the FBI, pretty much resonated with what Joe McCarthy was saying. And, it's just something to really be careful about, particularly for impressionable young people that might do something as stupid as writing a letter to Radio Moscow. So anyway, I had all this background, and I was kind of a typical child of the 50s. And so I was totally, Sputnik, I started collecting rocks then, probably why I became a geologist, but Sputnik made me look up. It made me, I wasn't interested in astronomy, but it made me look up and think about space, and that was a really formative part of my career. Following that, I went off to Washington Lee, really became enamored of geology, and then graduated and went on to Brown University. And interestingly, things, weaved in and out in terms of my interaction with Russia and the Soviet Union. When I was at Brown, I was studying, I probably going to work for an oil company because I was studying limestones in the Appalachians. And the key thing was that I was actually funded by the National Defense Education Act, which was the post-Sputnik huge surge of money that came in to get us caught up with science and engineering. So I could actually study limestones in the Appalachian Mountains using money that came ultimately from the Sputnik results. So that was pretty impressive to me. But meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, of course, all kinds of things are going on. You can look here, you can see Yuri Gagarin, I think it's Tereshkova, the first woman in space. And interestingly, the person in the middle there is Sergei Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev's son. And he actually is a rocket scientist in his own right. He worked for Chilemea's design bureau, which was one of the two major, with Korolev, one of the two major design bureaus for the Soviet, both human and automated programs for the moon. So that was all going on, and of course, they were really going at it in spades. You can see I'm a collector here. These are all space pens that I've accumulated over the years. But the photographs in the middle indicate in the upper left a Lunicod, which is an automated rover. This, actually, I've learned later, was the rover they were going to use for the human exploration and drive it around the surface with humans. On the bottom is an automated lunar sample return vehicle, which they did successfully 3 times. They actually were going to upstage us on Apollo 11 by bringing samples back to the Earth before the astronauts got back. But they didn't understand the gravity field very well, and that vehicle crashed into the moon. If it hadn't been, there would have been a huge thing. We don't have to go to the moon with humans. We don't have to waste all that money. We bring the samples back by superior Soviet technology. And it didn't happen. But it surely could have, because they did it successfully 3 times after that. And on the right there, you can see, in fact, a Soviet cosmonaut on the moon. And indeed, they were going. So this was all going on. Lots of, you can see it all in their space paintings and everything else. It's just incredible, very well organized. But I was at Brown University, and I went to Brown as a graduate student. And again, I was working in this area, the limestones in the Appalachians. And I fell under the spell of Tim Much, who was a professor there. Tim was about 6'2". And we always kidded that he could see the horizon and we really couldn't. So he was always thinking ahead. And indeed he was, because one day in class, there were several of us in a seminar class, and Tim, as he was wont to do, in the middle of the lecture, kind of just walked to the window and looked out, and we always were used to that because he was thinking about something. He turned around and he said, there's just no fundamental problems left in Earth stratigraphy. Oh, my God. So this is a year and a half before graduating, and all of a sudden our advisor tells us there's no problems. Okay. So what he was thinking was that things had plateaued in the field. So the deal was that he said, look, we really need to think about things in a new way. We need to approach things from the point of view of using remote sensing. We use remote sensing. We need to take those tools, figure out what we can learn about the Earth, and then turn that to the planets. Now, this is what we do every day now. But Tim was one of the first people to really see that. So in fact, he got us motivated, and in my last year at Brown, he went off on sabbatical. That was it. He went to work at the USGS in Flagstaff, Arizona, under Gene Shoemaker, and started learning planetary geoscience. I was interested in getting a job, so I interviewed in Houston with a lot of oil companies, But I had a book called a College Placement Annual, and it's the kind of thing in those days, it was actually a hard copy. Most people don't know what a book is anymore, but it was a bound kind of thing. You open it up and look at the index, and it had geologist, page 15 to 27. All the ads were there. And then it had page 62. And I guess in retrospect, Tim had taught me to look at the outliers. And so I said, what's on page 62? I turned to that page, and it was a single page like this with a picture of the moon, and it said, our job is to think our way to the moon and back. And if you're interested, down in the corner was a little phone number. And boy, how do you do that? That so grabbed my imagination. It's like unbelievable. So I called the number. It was NASA headquarters. And with absolutely no experience for the moon, except for this couple of courses we'd done, I got the job. And I know in retrospect now, I got the job because nobody knew what they were doing. Okay, so I wasn't real special that way, if you know what I mean. There was no, no lunar scientists really, well-trained lunar scientists, and they were looking for people that could put things together in a geological sense. So that was my first job, and it was just amazing. As George described the kind of things we were involved in, landing site selection, astronaut training, field trips all over the planet, mission operations during the missions, data analysis when they came back, and it was a stunning program. I mean, it's hardly even a program. Of course, at the time, we were racing the Soviets to the moon, but, in a way, that was always kind of in the back seat. The excitement was doing it, was learning about the moon and all these other things. We interacted with the Soviets, but really not in a heavy-duty way. And the goal was to fulfill President Kennedy's challenge to everyone in the country. It was not to beat the Soviets at that time. Of course, that was a huge political pretext and context, but for us, it was just to fulfill the goal and see that we could do it. So I was involved with the Russians at that time, but not heavily. I should point out too, Chris Kraft, who we were honored to join George for dinner Sunday night. This is a book that you should try to get a hold of. I hope it's in the library because it's going for a couple $100 on the web now. It's out of print, but this fills in. If you're interested in how we got from the get-go, like President Kennedy's speech, to actually having something happen in the matter of just a couple of years, this book is absolutely fantastic. It fills in all the chapters that actually happened before I got to NASA headquarters. I arrived at NASA headquarters at Apollo 7. And, that was the first test of the Earth orbital. And so much had gone into the program before then. And Chris's book was a real education to me about the shoulders of the giants that I was standing on at that time. Well, Tim, after the Apollo program, encouraged me to come back to Brown University. At that point, I was a stratigrapher, by Ph.D., but he wanted to start a planetary program. So he and the faculty invited me to come back and help out with that program. At that time, which I gladly did, by the way, it's a great place to be, Tim had gone on to Mars, ever the visionary, he was bored with the moon. He went on to Mars, and so I was left there picking up the lunar program because we just had all this data. It was absolutely fantastic. So we made a really good pair in that sense because we attracted students. Some wanted to go to Mars, some wanted to look at the lunar data, and together we began to think about and learn about the planets. And the Soviets were also exploring Mars, but not very successfully. These are some of the portrayals. That's Viking in the middle there. Some of the portrayals on the left middle, you can see Mars 2 and 3 heading towards Mars. Well, they actually went right by Mars without doing anything. It was not a very successful set of missions. They were much more successful, as we'll see in a couple of minutes here, with the activities at Venus. Phenomenally successful at Venus, and that comes back into the story in a couple of minutes. So while I was early on at Brown, we had a kind of a post-Apollo, the first U.S.-Soviet meeting on comparative planetology in Moscow in 1973. And I went there with my 2 daughters and wife, and it was just an unbelievable thing for me to see. Incredible hospitality. I had, in working on the scientific aspects up to this time, had corresponded with Russian scientists by letter because they were doing so much really good work based on their automated probes, etc. So I'd already started connections with working with the Soviets, but this is when I really started to meet them. So we met, we spent time in their laboratories. Jack Schmidt, the Apollo 17 geologist, lunar module pilot, was there, and I knew Jack really well. So we went to the labs together and talked about the surface of the moon and all the geology, and really made good friendships, personal interactions, which were related to our activities professionally, but it was the first real interaction, where you say, I want to know more about what these people are doing, and I want to learn more about them in general. So that was pretty much the beginning of the reconvergence, if you will, for me personally, with the Soviet Union. Let me just talk briefly, because this is an important message, about the evolution of communications here. I'll talk a little bit about this. In those days, snail mail was pretty much the way you did things. And I would, not wanting to be an ugly American, I would not just send a letter in English. I would go over to the Slavic languages department, hire a student, and have that student come over and help me translate my letter. And I'd send 2 copies, one in Russian and one in English. So, you know, I just wanted to facilitate the communication and try to make an effort to understand what's going on. Interesting, Ann and I, this past, for the 50th MicroSymposium in Moscow just recently, rendezvoused with one of those interpreters who had helped me write the letters, who was a student at Brown. He is currently the head of Goldman Sachs in Moscow for all of Russia. So that was a good hire, I'll tell you. But amazing guy, and he just really wants to help out, and it was amazing. But that's the kind of thing, again, involving the students in this kind of effort, even as Slavic language translator, was really, really a fundamental thing. We used to do telephone calls, too. In those days, you had to make an appointment to make a telephone call. And so you'd call up and you'd make an appointment. I guess it took like a day or so to get all the CIA, to KGB, and whoever else was listening in all wired up. But you'd get a call like at 1 in the morning, say, okay, your call is scheduled for 3:30. We'll call you every half an hour, a brief, you know, to tell you. It's like, God, you get no sleep. One call, and of course it was terrible because everybody was listening in and you couldn't really hear much. So that was not a very productive way to communicate. So communication was really minimal, but visits were really important. So again, I'll come back to this, but throughout this, the Soviets had real problems traveling. Of course, because there was so much control on what was going on. We were much more flexible with that, so we ended up going there a lot. They came to the major meetings, usually a small delegation of 3 people every year to our lunar science conferences, and that was the beginning of a lot more communication after I'd been there in the first place. I'll come back to this in a minute because it's an important point. So in these subsequent years, in the 1970s, for example, we were exploring all these other planets. We had missions to Mars, we had missions to Mercury. We were starting to think about Venus, the one, that big orange one in the middle there. And of course, we were putting all this in the perspective of Earth. So we were going from planet to planet exploring these things. And then we began to compare them. Comparative planetology was born. It was something where it's like comparative anatomy. You know, you start comparing things. You do, this looks like this is different, this is similar, and you learn huge lessons there. So why is the Earth so different than Venus? Why are the small planets so different from the large planets? All this was important, really important information. And one of the keys to the puzzle was the fact that Venus was the same size as Earth, and the same, more or less, position in the solar system, same density, more or less, and very different from the smaller terrestrial planetary bodies. So what did it look like? Why did it look so different? Why did it have a carbon dioxide atmosphere as opposed to the nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere we enjoy here on the Earth? So Venus became a big, huge point in comparative planetology. If we didn't know what was going on there, we couldn't put the pieces of the puzzle together. So this is what really generated my interest, again, communicating with the Soviets, because they had been phenomenally successful in exploring Venus. For example, they sent spacecraft not only to orbit Venus, but dropped landers, shown in the middle here, all the way down to the surface, and actually took pictures of the surface, pull samples inside, this is in the 1970s, pull samples inside, analyze them, and return all that data. Just phenomenal, before the spacecraft ultimately heated up sufficiently, because it's like hot enough to melt lead on the surface. It's like the inside of a self-cleaning oven, for example, not the kind of place you want to do field geology without a really heavy suit. So we were really interested in this, and so we began to think about, in fact, who was involved in this. And of course, there were 2 major research institutes, and so my trajectories are beginning to converge again with the Soviet Union because of these interests. The V.I. Vernadsky Institute for Geochemistry and Analytical Chemistry in Moscow. It's up on the Lenin Hills overlooking the big sports stadium there, a beautiful, beautiful place. And the second one was the Institute for Space Research, which is further along in Moscow in the suburbs. Those are the 2 major space research institutes. But the one that interested me most was Vernadsky Institute, because in fact they analyzed the samples, they had the geologists who were doing this, and they were doing the same kind of analyses that we were doing at Brown. So this was the beginning of what we call the Brown-Vernadsky institution-to-institution agreement. So I want to take a minute to just describe some of these things here, to talk a little bit about this, because this is kind of the meat of what might be a helpful message, I hope, in terms of what was going on. Because of my experience with international cooperation in my career, I had been asked to serve on the U.S.-Soviet Joint Working Group. This is the official government-to-government interaction, and I was happy to do that. I learned a lot, worked with a lot of really good people there, but it was a political entity, as you I'm sure know. And so it suffered not only from the pluses when things happen positively, but anything that happened negatively, it would tank, okay? So if you can think of sort of like time, going along with time, you know, oh, things are good with the Russians. It's great. Let's do all these joint things together. Oh, you know, they're invading Afghanistan or you know, I don't know, Poland's heating up or what, poof, goes right down. You cancel everything. And it just goes up and down like that. And that's the way it was. It was a real roller coaster ride for a scientist who's just trying to, you know, solve some scientific problems here. So we had a meeting in Houston where I was on the Joint Committee, and I was working with the Director of Solar System Exploration at NASA. And since I'd gotten to know these people in Moscow, he always took me with him to talk to them, which was quite an honor. And so what happened was that Jeff took me in, Jeff Briggs was the gentleman's name, took me into a small room. He said, Jim, I just received some bad news from NASA headquarters because of, you know, fill in the crisis. I'm not even sure I remember which one it was, but somebody had gotten shot or, you know, who knows. I don't mean to demean that at all, but it was yet another crisis. I've just received word that the U.S.-Soviet agreement has been canceled by the State Department. So, so we had scheduled a meeting with academician Barsukov, who was the chief of the delegation. So we went in, sat down with him, and Barsukov had just gotten the brand new data from Venus, and he whips this thing out of his briefcase and presents it to Jeff. Jeff, I'd like to, you know, present you with the latest results from the Soviet missions to the surface of Venus. And oh my God, these things, you know, I'm going crazy trying to look over and see what these things look like. And Jeff said, thank you very much, we're canceling the agreement. And I thought, gee, that's impolite if nothing else, you know, but that's what you have to do. Those are the instructions, etc. So you know, we were going nowhere. We weren't going back to Moscow till that healed over, till the whole thing was renegotiated again. And so that taught me a lesson about that kind of interaction. You have to do it, it's important, but it's not the way to make progress scientifically necessarily. So I was so excited by these images. Barsukov must have seen me like looking over. So as the heat died down and we kind of like, okay, that's fine, the meeting's over, he opens his other briefcase and opens up this whole thing with these sets of images. And then we're looking at them, and so another couple of Russian scientists come up, and we had this great discussion about the interpretation of the surface. We got so excited about it that he actually said, he reached in his briefcase and he pulled out a whole set of these things and just handed them to me. I almost fell over. And he said, listen, why don't you come to Moscow and we can talk more about these images. I mean, it's obvious you have a lot of thoughts about them. We have the data. We'd like to collaborate on that. And I was just stunned. And I was so naive at the time, you know, of course. I was so excited about the science. I was so naive that I actually, he said, I'll pay, you know, you come, I'll pay all your in-country expenses. And I made the audacious suggestion, can I bring a student? You know, this kid, you know what I mean? You know, but I did. Okay, I was kind of embarrassing in retrospect, but I asked him if I could bring a student. And so he said, okay, I think so. Yeah, so okay, that's good. And so I brought a young student named, one of my students who was working on the Mars lander data to compare to the Venus stuff. His name was Jim Garvin. He recently had served as the chief scientist of NASA, which was a nice position, and he's worked his way up in the world, and part of it is because he went to that meeting and was one of the key people to get this started. So he learned a lot on that. So that's how it started out. And I should say a couple of other things too about Barsukov. This man. This is a really important lesson for this kind of interaction. If you don't have the right kind of people, things are just going to go nowhere. I think that's the way in business and science and all sorts of other things. Barsukov was not liked by a lot of the really traditional Russian scientists because, in fact, he had had experience in the Communist Central Committee. He'd served in the Central Committee. So they saw him as not a true scientist, but as somebody who was a politician. And he was also very closely connected to the Soviet industry. I mean, if you can imagine working in the Central Committee of the Communist Party, you got all kinds of connections. Barsukov was a wonderful man. His goal was to make the cooperation work and learn from it. He knew the system, and this was powerfully important in our overall interactions because he knew how to make things happen. So he also had extremely good connections with the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and ultimately he became an academician. So the initial steps to this, so we got this idea. Look, the international things with the U.S.-Soviet things, they're not working very well. Why don't we have an institution-to-institution agreement? You came here, you brought a student. Why don't we have Brown and Vernadsky have an institution-to-institution agreement. Well, I thought, gee, that's really a good idea. So he set off to try to solve the problem politically on his end, and just the kind of person he was, he told me later that, and one of his colleagues told me that they, of course, ran the thing all through the foreign ministry. It went over the, over to the Russian embassy in D.C., went all through the whole things, and finally, after a few months, Barsukov received this letter from the foreign ministry, and the story I heard from his deputy was that Barsukov read the thing over and over, over and over. He read it out loud to him 3 or 4 times, and he says, "I can't tell whether this says yes or no." And he said, "It says yes." Okay, so that was the kind of guy he was. I mean, personally, I wouldn't have taken that chance in the Soviet Union, you know what I mean? Because it might have meant no, and then I don't know. I mean, vacation spots in the Gulag are not what I have in mind. But anyway, so that was the powerful man there who wanted to get something done and took initiative. So the second thing was that we had processes on the U.S. side, and I was really lucky at Brown because President Howard Swearer was a Russian scholar, wonderful man, and he looked at this and he said, "This is something we really want to do." I very naively went up to him and asked him about this, etc. Not only that, but Tom Watson, who was the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, was a Brown graduate and was on the Brown Board of Trustees, and he had started a Center for Foreign Policy Development at Brown with Mark Garrison, who was his first secretary in the embassy in Moscow. And Mark was the director of the Center for Foreign Policy Development. And so I went to see Mark, and he was just wonderful. He set me up. He gave me huge amounts of advice about what to do. He also told me to do the rounds, so to speak. Not only to go see NASA, which of course I was going to do, but go talk to the Department of State, to all the other agencies that have acronyms, and just tell them what's going on and get their response, engage their response. And that's exactly what I did, and I'll come back to talk about that in a couple of minutes. But it was really important because it was a bottoms-up kind of activity, but indeed he had the very right advice of making sure that you cleared it at all the top levels. And that was another, I think one of the lessons is, bottom-up really works well, but you need to have the high-level kinds of interactions, etc. So what was the basic agreement that we reached, okay? It had 3 components which were insisted on by Barsukov and were fine with me. The first one was engage of personnel. We had short and long-term visits, for example. In-country expenses would be paid by the host institution. So for the last, Lord knows how many years, probably, 25 probably, we've had, for a period of a couple of months in the spring, 2 Russian scientists come over and spend 2 to 3 months with us. It's wonderful for the students. Wonderful for the students. Some of our students go over there. We take them for the trips. We take undergraduates over. It's just incredible for them. We really encourage young people in this. And just to give you another idea about how great Barsukov was, we said, look, we'd like to bring some young Russian scientists over. Well, in the first days of the MicroSymposium, there was no way. He said, "Jim, that's impossible. You cannot possibly bring young Russian scientists because there are older Russian scientists in the academy who want to go. And there is no way that somebody young is going to go to a foreign country, particularly the U.S., before they do." But, he said, how are we going to solve this problem? So it wasn't like that can't happen. We sat down, had a couple of shots of vodka, clears the mind. And he said, if you can put a constraint on this, that the money can't be used except by young scientists, I can go to the academy and say, use it or lose it, you know what I mean? And so we created, right there, the Young Scientist Research Traveler Award, okay? And so I sent him a letter that said, we have this award. Congratulations, the young student of your choice has gotten this. And so they, that's what they did. And we had great success. We had a bunch of young people come over, and they really benefited from that, as our students did as well. The second thing was exchange of data. They really wanted to, you think about, oh gosh, they're going to get our data. But actually, the 70s were like a total, 70s and parts of the 80s were a total desert for us. We were not sending very many planetary missions at all. The Soviets in that decade sent 14. We sent maybe 2 to other planets. So they had the data. So, you think about, our data will be hemorrhaging towards them. It was totally the other way around. We got digital lander data, okay, from the Soviet landers. The digital data, okay, the top 2 pictures are in fact the Venera 9 and 10 data, gotten in 1975, pictures of the surface of Venus. The other ones in March 1982 were, in fact, data from the surface of Venus in color and black and white and spectral data. It was just amazing stuff. Well, these are the pictures at the bottom that I got from Barsukov in those early days. They were just prints, okay? But yet I could learn a lot from them. We needed the digital data in order to make something happen. It took 2 years to get it. Barsukov's responsible for this. You know, the coordinates of the tracking stations that were getting the data were on the tape, you know, so that had to be sanitized off. Of course, everybody knew where they were anyway, but nobody was going to give away that data. And so we ultimately got, I carried out of Moscow a digital data tape that had all these data on. And in fact, we did a joint project. And this is just a report in Science, a reasonably reputable journal, okay, where we took these data, did some laboratory experiments, and analyzed the data in cooperation with a series of the scientists who, Barsukov, Basilevsky, Hodorkovsky, Selivanov, Panflov, Getkin, and Narieva. All of those people were involved in the acquisition and testing of the data, and we worked with them on this really amazing project to learn something about the oxidation state and the color of the surface of Venus. So that was a big benefit. The second thing we did was we got Venera 1516 digital radar image data. The United States was trying to do a mission to Venus, which would be a mission which would get at something like some of these, map the surface of Venus, the geology, through the clouds using radar. And the Soviet Union had decided that they were going to do that too for about 20% of the surface of the upper part of Venus. Well, we wanted to get these data, to look at them. They gave us some prints from time to time, and if you take a look here, you can see the kinds of things, the prints were the things in the lower left hand, the upper part is the spacecraft. We were able to do geological maps from these with the Russians, and so we really wanted to get these data. There were 21 digital data tapes, 21 of them, and I carried those out of Sheremetyevo, like I had them up my arm, you know, because you can't put them in a box, because, you know, you have to take the data tapes. And I had a piece of paper with so many Soviet stamps and seals and signatures on it. Unfortunately, I would love to have that today, but at the last gate, you know, the Niet man said, da, and took the piece and then let me go. And so I carried 21 digital data tapes, the whole data set here, to Brown. We promptly put it in the National Space Science Data Center, and in fact, it was available to the whole community. That was huge, really important, and it helped us fly Magellan. It was very important. Barsukov knew that this was an investment in the Magellan mission, that we were almost certainly going to fly a few years later to Venus. And in fact, ultimately, his scientists became collaborators and actually guest scientists on that mission as well. So he was investing in the future, and it paid off. We gave them Mars Viking data to help prepare their Mars 96 missions, etc. And the other thing we gave them were fax machines. You know, I mean, who uses a fax machine anymore? In those days, it was big news. Big news, okay? So, you know, we said, gee, you know, they said, could you possibly think, I remember sitting there having them watch a fax come in at Brown, and they're going, oh my God, this is incredible. You know, so, Jean, do you think we can have one of these? I said, well, let me think about it. So I carried 2 fax machines over there in a big box. It cost, I mean, at that time they were like about $1 each, actually, so nothing to sneeze at. But, you know, by this time I'd been to Moscow quite a number of times, and so I had these huge boxes, and they're kind of like carry-on, you know what I mean? So I got these boxes, and I'm going out, and I knew I was going to have a hard time when I got there. But fortunately, there was one of these ugly Americans in front of me who, at the customs and immigration place, and the Soviet guard asked him, so do you have any letters for Soviet citizens? He says, yeah. And, you know, which is against the law, basically. So, okay, that's the kind of person you don't want to be behind in any line, okay? He was going to make a point. Yes, I have. What are you going to do about it? Well, you know, so I sit there and I looked at the Russian guy and I roll my eyes like, oh my God, you know. And he looked at me and he goes, you know, some obscene Russian word, pointed at this guy. And so he looks at me and he just going through. He used me to make a point to this guy, you know what I mean? See, I never saw that guy again. He's probably still there. But so I'm kicking these 2 big fax boxes around all this security. And, you know, we started faxing. It was amazing, amazing. The only thing I'd have to do is fill up a suitcase with fax paper every time I came over after that. But this was really amazing. I mean, really amazing, and just the kind of thing. Now, of course, at this point, NASA's saying, in the ups and downs, you know what I mean, they're getting a little jealous that we're having success here, and I don't want to say we ever tried to, say anything untoward there. But the key point was that when things were down, okay, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were not participating with each other or communicating formally at all, the Brown-Vernadsky meetings would serve as the conduit for discussions. We'd have them at Brown. NASA personnel would fly to Brown, and we would interact at the meeting, at the MicroSymposium, and then I would arrange a dinner at some private place somewhere where we'd all sit down and we'd have our meetings. So the U.S.-Soviet interactions didn't start from square one when the agreements were renegotiated, because we kept them alive all the way along with these kinds of interactions. NASA was really happy with that because it gave them the opportunity to do this. The other agencies, the ones I mentioned, were also very happy with that because they didn't want to go to zero. They wanted to keep some communications going so they'd know what was going on. And so this agreement worked really well in this context. And I would just say the second thing, though, is you always have to deal with NASA headquarters is that, no offense here, George, is that, you know, I got this call one day, which was, hi, this is so-and-so from NASA headquarters. We understand you bought the Soviet Institute's fax machines. Is that true? I said, yes, it's true. Well, you didn't spend NASA money on that, did you? I said, oh, of course not. No, we private funds, not a problem. That's good. I didn't think you were that stupid. There's a kind of a lull. By the way, can we have the number for those fax machines? You know, so you know, it all works out. You know, but so we did everybody a service there. In any case, the other thing was the joint meetings, and this is something that's really important. This is part of the fundamental aspect of this interaction, and it was the glue that held everything together while we were doing these other things. So we had the MicroSymposia. Now, why are they called MicroSymposia? Well, Barsukov comes in here again. Barsukov started out with, we're going to have a Brown-Vernadsky symposium. So he calls the Moscow City Council, or whoever it is you call, and they said, this summer? No way. You know, super, niet. I mean, like, there's no way. You have to plan symposia 10 years in advance. You know, it's a 5-year plan. It's not in this 5-year plan. And Barsukov, you know, you could see the steam coming out. He said, niet symposia, microsymposia, you know, so microsymposium. So, you know, I can just see them now. Micro, I guess that's okay. So that's why it's called a microsymposium. That's why we're having it, because we didn't have to deal with anybody at all. We just dealt with it ourselves. So again, that's his problem-solving ability. It really quite remarkable. So we had 2 meetings a year was the agreement. One would be in the United States, usually at Brown, and the other would be in the Soviet Union somewhere. We've had almost all of them in Moscow, but we had one in Armenia, which is legendary. I almost died of Armenian hospitality. It was just incredible. Michael will tell you all about it. It's just amazing. So I just want to point out a few things about this, because the microsymposia were really what held us together, engaged huge numbers of other people. We had 2 different kinds of microsymposia. The one in the Soviet Union was always a general comparative planetology microsymposium, because their community could not get out in numbers, and so we brought comparative planetology to them, and they contributed to it. In the U.S., it was much more thematic. What we would do initially was to get the people together to actually meet the Russians. We had them at Brown for 15 or 20 years, maybe 10 or 15 years, and people would come to Brown to be able to interact with the Russians because they couldn't do that otherwise. So that was the service that it initially served. Then we started going to thematic conferences, like you'll see here, geological evidence of climate change, for example, for one of them. Then these things evolved to a whole series of different thematic conferences, and I'll just show you some pictures here of the posters that we have. Water on Mars, some periods of Mars history, Phobos, one of the spacecraft, one of the moons that are orbiting Mars, etc. Just a whole set of these things. We looked at different aspects, maybe Galileo and Jupiter, the Great Red Spot, and so on. This one in the upper right was fascinating because this is actually the surface of Mars with St. Basil's in the background, and the Russian sense of humor is so wonderful. You know, one of the old Russian guys came up and looked at the poster and he said, "This is in the mid-'90s when things had the transition to today was taking place, and it was a complete disaster with Yeltsin running around, all kinds of crazy things going on." And he looks at it and says, Moscow after Reconstruction, you know. So, in any case, they've been going on for this period of time. We just had the 51st one up here in the Woodlands earlier. It was a huge success, 170 people, all international participation from China, from Europe, from Japan, from all over the place. And it's been really amazing. Let me just say a few things through pictures about why this was so important. We were able to engage additional Russian people. This is Yuri Shkaratov and his wife at the top. He's a Ukrainian scientist, and today they come to the meetings, they participate, we have interactions with them. He comes to visit Brown from time to time. In the lower left, you'll see in the middle one of the people from IKI. And in the middle on the right is Jim Garvin, that very same person who was one of the first people, the first student to go, and Carly Peters and one of the Soviet scientists. So additional Russian participation, not just from Vernadsky, but from IKI. We did a lot of social and cultural activities. This was critically important and a wonderful time for all of us. You know, my family, my young girls, just all the students really learned from this. Of course, this is a 4th of July parade in Bristol, Rhode Island, the oldest 4th of July parade in the country. And the two Russians have just met Uncle Sam and Betsy Ross, I think it is. So great fun. And you learn so much during these kinds of things. We had wonderful parties where we would, Barsukov, this is Barsukov in the upper left. He was a gypsy and just an amazing guy. He would sweep into a room with his huge overcoat, and it was just commanding presence. In the lower left, we have the director of another institute and one of his top scientists. You can see that the beer and vodka flowed fairly freely. People are smiling all too much, I think. In the upper right is a young man named Brennan Close, who was from Harvard, who worked with us, and he helped us translate, because he had actually grown up partly in Russia. His dad was with the Washington Post, and he, among the many stories of success here, he actually ended up marrying a Russian woman, and he's there to this day. So we see him when we go to Moscow. I should say, too, the importance of involving young students. You'll see in the upper one, the two people on the left went on to professional careers. Dave Sinsky is chief of many projects at the Jet Propulsion Lab. The woman, second in, is Maria Zuber. She's a Brown student who is now the head of the Earth and Planetary Science Department at MIT. And she is visiting Russian scientists, and interacting with them as well. On the left, in the lower left, it's Ellen Stofan, who is a key scientist in the Venus realm. She essentially got her background from interacting with the Russians. She spent about a month or two there working on their Venus data. We also had international participation. I won't mention here, but the upper people are from the UK, and the lower ones are from France primarily. They were very anxious to come. They offered a lot. We also involved Russian space officials. The person in the upper left, one of the smartest decisions ever made was to turn Rol Kremyev, that man there, the chief engineer of many Soviet space missions, turn the carving of the turkey over to the guy, okay? And so what he's got is this proud, an engineer really knows how to do this sort of thing, okay? So, but we involved all of them, and it was really great. Many people from different parts of the Soviet space industry came and participated as well. So the other thing we have is just a little bit of background about changes here. The advent of the American buffet. We used to have every year at the MicroSymposium a huge banquet. We'd all go to some hotel, and it would just be wonderful. We'd sit around, have a lot of vodka and special dishes, etc. But when the country started to tank a little bit in the early 90s, it was much harder and harder for them to do that. So I remember sitting at a banquet one time next to Barsukov. I was the head of the delegation, and he's carving his chicken, and he goes, "Jim, this chicken has no meat on it." And Frank Perdue would die. Just even looking at this thing. You carve into the skin, and there was no meat on the chicken. I don't know how the thing could have stood up, you know what I mean? But there wasn't, okay? And so it became clear that they were spending huge amounts of money to do this banquet, which was just a disaster, okay? So we stepped in and says, why don't you let us do an American buffet? We so much appreciate coming over here. We'll come over. One of the nights, we will, in fact, cook dinner, okay? And so we'll have a dinner for everybody, and it'll be American kinds of things. We got the Europeans involved, bringing all sorts of European dishes and hams and stuff like that. And so we would do one night, one of the 3 nights that we were there for the MicroSymposium, we would do the American buffet. And it's a legend. It's a legend. It's just amazing. And so I won't mention the special wine. We'll skip over. Ask me a question later if you want. So that's the tradition. Now, my wife Ann, who is in charge of actually the MicroSymposia, she has these great ideas for what we should do every year. No, we did that last year. We did tacos last year. We're going to do something different. So one year she said, I want to do New England clam chowder. I said, oh, please no. Please no. You know, no, I really want to do New England clam chowder. And so, oh, God. Okay, so we'll take snows, we'll take cans of things, we'll make it all up there. All we have to do is heat it up and cook for 80 or 100, you know, enough clam chowder. And they have a kitchen there in the cafeteria, so we emailed Sasha at this point and said, Sasha, can you please arrange for us to, do you have like, in the cafeteria there, do you have electric or gas stoves? You know, oh, no problem, we have both. It's not a problem at all. Okay, so you got both electric. Oh, not a problem. It's not a problem. So we get there. We're all happy. We know we're going to be able to go to these huge stoves and cook all this, you know, one big burner and so on. And so Ann disappears while I'm trying to run the sessions, takes all the stuff, comes back a little later, kind of like a little pale. And I said, what's the problem? Didn't they have the electric? Oh, no. She said, yeah, they have both gas and electric. And we, this will show you what they have. Okay. They had gas, a Bunsen burner, and they had electric, a hot plate. And then as Ann said, at this very moment, she said, yes, they had, and she explained to me what was going on. And she said, it's in a hood, and there's a lot of chemicals, unlabeled, of dubious origin in the background. So in any case, you know, you do what you have to do. So Ann made, you know, clam chowder for... Yeah, it was great fun. So those are the kinds of traditions anyway. We went to Armenia, and as I said, you can see, if you just look at my eyes in the upper left-hand picture, you can see where, this is when I was beginning to cave from Armenian hospitality. It was a great, great time. And the man there on the left, and the rotund guy there is, he was an amazing, Rudolf Gevorkian. Amazing man, the head of the institute there, and he came back. We invited him to come back to Brown the next year. We gave him an honorary citizenship of the city of Providence. The mayor made up a nice thing, and we got our Armenian friends on the lower left who run a great Armenian restaurant. We had Armenian food, and it was interesting that when we told the people in about a year later. President Gregorian, an Armenian, was named to be the president of Brown. And so I emailed Barsakov. I said, Valery, we just had named an Armenian president of Brown University. He said, he emails back, that's the first result of Rudolph's visit. Okay. I've never met so many Armenians in my life. We went to greet Rudolph at the airport, and we were surrounded by 50 people. I thought, why are there so many people here? And when he got off, they were all Armenians. It was just amazing. What a wonderful outpouring. We learned a lot about our own community. Along about this time, we started to interact with the Institute for Space Research. This is Kremnev on the left again, and Rol Sagdayev on the right, because the Soviets were exploring Phobos. They asked me to be on their Phobos mission. We actually had an exchange agreement with them as well, and we ended up spending a lot of time studying Phobos and spending a lot more time there. And here you can see a group of scientists at IKI. IKI and Vernadsky were fierce competitors, so it was very difficult to kind of like navigate these waters, but I basically tried to keep a very straightforward relationship with both of them and never do anything that would, offend anyone. And it seemed to work really well. So they respected my interaction with the other person, and it was very successful, even with their fierce competition. Also at this time, Iki and Sagdayev were becoming interested in national security, and of course, the Center for Foreign Policy Development was also very important there. So that's Tom Watson on the left, shaking hands with Sagdayev. That's Mark Garrison in the upper left there. And Howard Swear, the president of Brown, on the right seated. And these are the really key people who had helped out. And so a lot of this led to more interaction in the mutual security field. And we had a lot of meetings related to that, which were not related to Brown-Vernadsky per se, but our early interactions really helped to contribute to that. Now, in the same time period, you probably are familiar with people like Richard Pearl, known to scientists as the Prince of Darkness, and Brzezinski. These people were high in the national security area, and they were very rightfully concerned about what scientists were doing. Scientists were viewed as kind of woolly-headed, kind of like people that don't have a clue what's going on. And one of the people, John Simpson, managed to get, without any authorization from the U.S., an experiment that he had built on a Soviet spacecraft. And, I have to say, I can't blame these people for being so apoplectic, because that is a really stupid thing to do, okay, with technology and all these other things. John was a great scientist, but I think he lacked a little in terms of the understanding of the, essentially the top-level aspects. I think he could have done that with going the right routes, but he didn't, and that created huge problems for us, because we were all viewed as someone like this who wasn't paying attention to what was going on and was a threat to national security. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but we use new technology. So you have this beautiful here, but this is like years ago. We actually got a video conferencing capability. I talked to Sagdayev about this. I said, I can't bring all my students. Can we broadcast some things back home? And he said, oh, yeah, I think I can work on that. About 6 months later, we get a call that says there's a Soviet ground station that's just been offloaded from a Soviet ship in New York City. Where do we want to put it? So we had this dish sitting next to the football field, and we could broadcast back and forth, and we did video conferences. It's just amazing. So social interactions were really important too. On the left there is Barsakov's widow. Sadly, Barsakov passed away in the middle of our interactions. That's his widow on the left, and Eric Galimov took over, the new director of Vernadsky. And shown on the in the middle right is that very same person that we saw there, Sergei Khrushchev. He actually became a professor at Brown University, and he is just an amazing contribution to our efforts, because, of course, he's a rocket scientist. He knows the whole history of the Soviet space program, and he's helped us immensely in terms of interacting with additional people in the Soviet Union and now Russia. And he's just an incredible person, too. He's just amazing. He and his wife, Valentina. And so this has added a huge personal dimension to what we've been doing. So let me just say the importance of the things we were doing here with the MicroSymposium. First of all, the exchange of data and ideas. Huge. These people think about things in a different way, in many ways, and we've benefited from that. The importance of socializing, I mean, it was just amazing to interact with these people and learn about their culture, their families, their history. I learned more about U.S. history, honestly, from going to these long dinners at Barsakov's house than I did in my career. I had to answer questions that I said, can I get back to you on that? Because I had no idea. So, do you read so-and-so author? And I said, yeah, it's an American author. You've never read any of, I'll check on it next. And, I'd come back, I'd read a book, and I'd come back and we could talk about it. How embarrassing is that? And we would just do all sorts of things that would really let us interact like this. And I, again, learned about my own history by trying to answer their questions and then going back and reading up on it. So I would also say that the American buffet was an important contribution, and we would also, for the 3 nights of the MicroSymposium, one night we would do the banquet or buffet. The second night we would have cultural events. We'd go to the opera, we'd go to the conservatory, we'd go to the circus. The third night we would have what was called the All Moscow Party. We would fan out all of us into houses of the different people, the apartments, and it would be wonderful. You'd interact with their families and so on. And at the micro buffet, we would have what's called a 6-slide rule. After all the vodka and all the food, we'd sit for several hours. People would bring up 5 to 6 slides at each of their, not of geology, they'd sneak geology in, but it would be about their vacation or about their home. And we do this and they do this, and it was a wonderful, wonderful interaction that way. So just let me press on here. We've talked about the fax machines, etc. As not only did NASA headquarters, of course, want the number, but I knew that things in the late 80s were going to change radically, because the Vernadsky Institute is right above where the tanks went into the city when the White House was under siege. The scientist, actually, Misha Ivanov, one of my dearest colleagues, was down on the front lines in the White House at night, in case the communist regime attacked the White House. He was willing to put his life down. During the day, he'd come up and sleep in Vernadsky. He'd look out the window to see what the tanks were doing, and he'd send me a fax. Now, you kind of knew things were coming apart at that point if you could send a fax out about where the troops were, you know what I mean? It was like amazing. So that really helped out. And then we went to internet and email, and it's just been amazing. Okay, let me try to summarize here and talk a little bit about what we learned and what we can say for the future. I'm sorry I'm going on so long here, but it's a very exciting thing for me. So let's just talk a little bit about these relationships with agencies. I mentioned earlier we did these. I think my bottom line here is be realistic, but don't be stupid. The realistic thing is that there is a huge amount of concern about national security. Absolutely no question about that, and we're right to be worried about that. But on the other hand, you can talk to people and understand what the needs are and what the concerns are, and then work your interactions in an appropriate manner. And that's what we tried to do. And Mark Garrison was the one that gave me that advice. So what I would do, okay, first of all, I was on the official USSR space delegation when we were doing negotiations, okay, and with these huge gaps in between. And I learned at that time how rigid that kind of negotiation was. We would go to some place like in Rome or Helsinki before we went into the Soviet Union. We get briefed by the ambassador there, and about what the position was, and what we could say and what we couldn't say. And we were just puppets. We were there for show because there was no real negotiations that went on. It had already been decided what we could do. If they suggested something and it wasn't one of those things, we couldn't even acknowledge it. No, can't do that because that's not in our instructions. Honestly, I thought that's what the Russian did. I didn't realize that's what we did too. It wasn't a pretty picture from my point of view as a naive scientist. But the key thing that we did was we learned a lot in the Brown-Vernadsky things. We set a lot of framework. We got people to say, gee, wouldn't it be nice to do this? Well, let's try that out. And I could get on the agenda back in the U.S., run it through the system, and then maybe it would be on the list of things to do. So that helped a lot. I should say that I made trip reports. I knew that people were really interested in what was going on, so I would just write a trip report at the end like normally people do. And I would just send it to NASA headquarters, to the Office of Space Science, and I'd send it to the International Office. And I was sure that that would get transported to all the other places, but I was not going to be involved in anything other than that. Things evolved a little bit with NASA. At some points, when administrators changed, the Deputy Associate Administrator was a little jealous of what was going on, and said, we should bring Brown-Vernadsky under the NASA umbrella. Well, this was not an umbrella I wanted to be standing under, okay, because it was clear that that would just link it to all the ups and downs. So we successfully waited, okay, and that passed. But you could see what the problem was there. A little bit of jealousy, etc. Different people at different times. We prevailed, and I think it's better for it. The Department of State was absolutely fantastic. They really wanted us to do this. We would visit, they'd invite us to come to the U.S. Embassy. In the early days, we'd get hamburgers at the U.S. Embassy. That was the big deal for the students after a week of salami for breakfast. And we'd always go to see the science attaché because that's the person you wanted to see. So we'd tell them what was going on, tell them about the meeting, invite them to come to the meeting. Sometimes they would. The science attaché, whenever I would come into town, we'd have long walks in Moscow. And he'd tell me what was going on, just in the general sense of how it looked for the Soviet economy and where things were headed. And I wasn't really pumped at all because, it was just kind of like a cordial kind of thing. Then it became clear that I was also being tested a little bit. And for several times, I was asked to come down to the State Department prior to some summit meetings because I was going to Moscow for the MicroSymposium. And they would ask me to talk to specific people in Moscow to tell them that these things were likely to be on the agenda. And that it would be good if they were prepared for it, like joint missions to planets and things like that. So that's what I would do. I would go and I would talk to the right people, and then they would work their end of the thing and have a delegation with Gorbachev or whoever it happened to be at the time going to Vienna or wherever they're going for the discussions. And so I felt that we had built up enough trust then that we were actually serving some kind of reasonable purpose here. The CIA was a different picture altogether. Mark Garrison had advised me that just not get involved. And of course, I hadn't had any plans to do that, but that his advice cemented that. The problem is, I think for us, we didn't want to get any entangling alliances on either side. And so we steered clear of that. Of course, subsequent to our visits to Moscow, the CIA, of course, my God, I'd hope they know when we went to Moscow. They do. And they would come by and ask if they could talk to me. And I said, sure, why not? And I would just answer their questions. They suggested to me that I might like to be involved in their university affiliate program. We can pay you to do. No, I don't think I want to do that. So we steered totally clear of those kinds of things. And I think it didn't harm anybody, and we were very successful. I think they learned what they wanted to know probably by getting the memos that I was writing to NASA headquarters. The FBI was really amazing. You know, I mean, all they're trying to do is to make sure these people aren't doing anything untoward in the U.S. Now, stolen cars and Russian spies, what does that mean? Rhode Island is the smallest state in the Union, and you may or may not be aware that the FBI spends a huge amount of time. They don't do intrastate things, they do interstate things. So, you know, one state has jurisdiction, another state has jurisdiction. If you steal a car and drive to another state, you've crossed state boundaries, and the FBI is going to look into that theft. In Rhode Island, you can't steal a car without going in another state. You know, you get it up to 50 miles an hour and you're in Massachusetts or Connecticut or whatever. And so I think, I don't know this, but I think Rhode Island is like the penal colony for FBI agents, because all they have to, you know, I mean, they just have huge number of these car cases because they're all, you know, they're all driven out of state. So when we got, you know, I would get the calls from the FBI chief, and he'd say, so what's going on? And I said, well, they're coming for this visit, blah, 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 blah. And he says, okay, I have a list here. You know, do you know any of these people? And you know, do you know if they're legitimate scientists? I said, sure, I'll tell you what I know. And so I'd go through the whole thing. And in the early days, there'd always be some person you'd never even seen before that came with a delegation. Not for Brown Vernadsky ever, but you know, with these kind of other delegations. And they, of course, always the KGB person. But in this kind of context, we would just, I would know all the people, and of course they were reporting back to the KGB, but as a group, not as an agent, okay, as it were. So I would tell them who they were and, you know, what they did. He's the chief of this lab in Vernadsky, et cetera. After a few of these kind of things, they really got, because we were cooperative, they had a lot of other things to do. So they'd call me up and say, can you take care of this? I mean, like if they want to go to the Groton, Connecticut to look at the submarine base, that's probably off limits. I said, I don't think I want to be involved in that. So they knew I knew that we weren't going to make stupid things here, and so pretty much that was it. They would call me up every once in a while and say, okay, is everything going fine? I said, fine. I said, no problems. We had no problems at all. We knew where they were the whole time, so blah, blah, blah. And that was great. Except one time I got this really panic call from the chief CIA, FBI guy. He said, listen, Jim, I got to come up. Listen, are you going to be in? When's your class over? I got to come. I thought, oh my God, what's happened? So he comes up and comes into my office with this huge, heavy briefcase, and you'll see this picture here. That's my office right there. He opens up the briefcase, and it's filled with Belgian beer. And he said, I just wanted to let you have this. You know, he said, I've been running around with this heavy briefcase. And so I figured at that point we'd reached a really good relationship with the FBI. So I would say the other thing is the KGB. That was pretty amazing. I read a huge number of books in the context of this. It was, you know, and just trying to get prepared. And one of them described the KGB as the organs. And I think that's the most appropriate commentary I've ever heard, because it is literally the organs of the Soviet body. It's just amazing. I read a lot of books about this. Usually you try to figure out who in the delegation is the person. For us, it wasn't a problem. I learned from my aunt, because I thought she worked for the State Department. That's what they always say. So that was really good education for me. So whenever I'd come up, the Soviet guy would come up and say, Mr. Head, I would like to know about your rocket engines. I'd go, oh, do you have a card? And they'd always say, no. There's only Russians that don't have cards, or the KGB, okay. I work for the State Department. I said, oh, okay. So I automatically knew that it was KGB. And, you know, you just be careful there and so on. And the only other untoward moment I had was when we were at JSC one time touring around, and Barsakov turns to me and says, Jim, is it possible to get a shuttle heat tile as a souvenir? I said, yeah. And that was it. So I think he'd done his job by asking, okay, which is what they asked him to do at home, and I did my job by saying no. Now, the other one that was really nice, there is indeed in the Soviet Union an anti-fraternization law. It is against the law to fraternize with somebody who is not a Russian citizen. I mean, it's against the law. So this is a huge deal. So when I would drive them around Brown, okay, 6 or 8 of them in a van, they would say in English, okay, so that was a really fun thing at Jim's friend so-and-so. How are we going to handle this in the report? So they're talking in English, and you know they're like, okay, so I make some suggestions. You know, why don't you call him an industrialist or something? Oh yeah, that's good. Okay, yeah. So I was helping them fill out their report to the KGB when they got home. But anyway, so all of these things were very important, and it was important to go through this whole thing to interact with these agencies in such a way that they were aware of what was going on. So what have we learned here? I think the important thing for these kinds of scientific interactions is to have tangible, concrete goals. The joint meetings, the visitor exchanges, and the data exchange. That was really important. Because I've seen these agreements come about, like lots of people called me up and said, can you send me a copy of the agreement? I said, sure. So we'd send them a copy. They'd negotiate something with IKI, and nothing would ever happen, because they never followed through with these kinds of things. I think it's important to have a bottom-up approach. If you don't have a fundamental reason to do this, it can be done from the top down, but you really need to have the students and the people who are dedicated to doing this to make it successful, but you need top-level coordination as well. Now, the interaction with other agencies, I've mentioned that. I would assertively communicate, but be neither naive nor stupid in the sense of trying to do something. We were really lucky in that we didn't make instruments in our lab. We mostly analyzed data. Okay, so that was a big help. People understood that from the agency's points of view. Be inclusive. Involve as many people as you can, particularly international, and change your list with changing times and trends. Make sure you're reaching out to all these people, just to use the same old list, but try to change that as a function of time. Engage in the families and the history and culture of your host. I can't underline how important that is. When at some point in the middle of this, one of the NASA associate administrators said, Jim, I need your help. I want to know what Barsukov likes. Okay, I said, okay, gin and tonic, take him tonic. They can't get tonic. He smokes these kinds of cigarettes. You want to do this, that, and the other thing. And so they got all prepared, and he said, come along, and I want you to introduce him to me. So I introduced him. He gave him all these great gifts. Barsukov's really pleased. And then the associate administrator turns to me and says, that's enough. You can go now. And so I was just thrown out of the meeting. And, that's fine, because I don't have to be party to everything. But Barsukov was infuriated that he would do that, because we'd built up this great personal relationship. He knew exactly how this guy knew what he liked. And here this guy was using me and then throwing me out. I think that's neither here nor there in the overall scheme of things. But the point is that you need to really engage these people on a personal level. You know what I mean? You really need to do that for success. And I don't see that across the boards. It's really important to do. Not only does it help in our interactions, but it just completely enriches your life and the life of the students and everything else. And again, I'll just press on here. Involve young people from the beginning, build to the future. The Young Student Award that we talked about here, we have Brown undergraduates and graduates going to Moscow, and it's just a life-changing event for them. It's just wonderful. Be sensitive to changing trends, the evolution of the Russian and American micros. We've evolved a lot there. And don't wait for the 10-minute aria. And what does that mean? You're all familiar with the idea of it's not over till a fat lady sings, and that refers to a Wagner opera in which the last part of the performance is Brunhilde singing for 10 solid minutes. And so for me, what that means is don't wait till it gets old and run down. We've had the last MicroSymposium in Moscow, number 50. We're continuing the American ones because there's a huge need for that. We're transitioning the one in Moscow to IKI. They're going to start running it now, and that's great because they're going to do comparative planetology for the Major Space Research Institute. So, you think, oh my God, it's over in Moscow in this particular thing. But no, it's just evolving. So that's important to know. Let me, again, now just finish up, honestly this time, by saying a little bit about the present and the future, Russia and beyond. It's not, honestly, you all, I'm sure, know more about this than I do from a foreign policy and a policy point of view, but I have to say from my own personal point of view, it is not at all a pretty picture. If you take a look at the badge, notice how closely the FSB badge looks like the KGB badge, and that's because the same people are there. Russia now, unfortunately, is the new mafia, in my opinion, and this is my own personal opinion here. They're not investing in the future. There's huge amounts of graft and corruption. They're using the petrodollars for foreign policy, blackmail and other kinds of things, and gas and oil, etc. They're not building to the future. This scares the hell out of me. The academies are suffering immensely. The people who work in the academies, like my scientific friends, are getting trivial salaries. We're actually letting them survive by bringing them to the U.S. for a couple of months a year to pay them not very much, but enough so they can live for the rest of the year. It's really tragic. They're not investing in the system, and it's just really tragic. And it ought to be, for all of us, a real problem. There's a danger there, because if they're not investing in the future, you know, they're going to go back to their old ways when things get tough. I hate to say it. So they're also having poor relationship with the Academy of Sciences. Not only they're kind of ignoring them, but if you take a look on the picture on the right there, that's the Soviet Academy of Sciences building. Bizarre building in downtown Moscow, or near downtown Moscow, right on the Moscow River there. The reason that the Soviet, the present government is so at odds with the Academy is the Academy owns a lot of really good land in Moscow. The government wants that land so they can make money on it. It's just incredible. So there's this huge competition. The Russian Academy of Sciences is not, I think, doing very well at all. I think they're stuck in the past. They started to elect institute directors about 10 years ago. But unfortunately, as one of my colleagues said, so I said, how's the democracy going? How are the elections going? You know, it's not very convenient. You can't predict the outcome. I said, yeah, that's a problem, isn't it? You know, and they, when the present director was elected, he actually wasn't elected. The other person was elected. So they had to do a second election. I mean, democracy is not quite what we define it as. Also, I tried to convince the current director to have a science advisory council to try to bring in scientists from all around the country, all around the world, so that they could see what they have there and actually make some communications with other institutions besides Brown. And he said in the most Soviet of ways, no, we deserve our fate. My God, that's the director of an institute. I hate to say it. Can you imagine that? It's just not very good. And finally, you know, we were there for the 50th anniversary of Sputnik, and it was an amazing party. And so we went to the institutes, and the institutes were, you know, we went to the party room, we went to the restrooms, and they were all just immaculate with new tiles, not like the old days, trust me. And all my colleagues were saying, isn't it wonderful? Look how successful things are. All things are really great now. And I said, no, let me tell you what's going on here. You go to the labs, they're the same. It turns out that the Russian institutes can rent space or sell part of their institute land, but they can't use that money for science. It has to be used for improving the building. So our meeting room is beautiful now, but the labs, they can't use it for salaries, you can't use it for equipment. How stupid is that, okay? But that's the old Soviet system, just incredible. So that's another problem, I think. One final one here is that the Russian Academy of Science had a 50th anniversary of Sputnik. It was a wonderful celebration. I got invited to give a talk on comparative planetology, and I said to my colleague Sasha Basilevsky, who's the head of the Russian Comparative Planetology Lab, I said, Sasha, you should give this talk. He said, Jim, I would never be asked to give a talk at the Academy of Sciences at this level, because he's only the chief of the Comparative Planetology Lab. He's not an academician. He's not a high up. When we had this wonderful celebration, the place was almost empty. And I said, why didn't you bring students from Moscow State University? This is an incredible event. No, it's only for the very important people. I mean, it just makes me cry sometimes. So let's just point out here that there's changing dynamics of the planetary science in Russia. The Vernadsky Institute, we finished up with that. EKI is emerging because they have one planetary mission, the Phobos-Grunt mission. It's a sample return mission for the moon from Phobos. We're working with them. We're converting to that. And so there's going to be, the good news, the Russian Comparative Planetology Symposium. And Russian industry is starting to work with the Indians and the Chinese as well. And where do we go from here? I think that not a very good picture for Russia. We've made a huge investment here, and I think we've benefited a lot from this. And I'd like to say that there's this vibrant planetary sciences community in Russia today, but the Russian government today is just killing it by lack of support, lack of missions, lack of investment in new technology and these kinds of things. It's not a very pretty picture. What is emerging, though, is all the other countries. And you're aware, I'm sure, that there's this new armada of international spacecraft that either are around the moon or are going to be. European Space Agency, Japanese Space Agency, Chinese, Indian, and NASA, oddly enough, the last of the five, now has a lunar reconnaissance orbiter. Russia, maybe. They're talking about it, but they're really not going to do it. So they're almost kind of out of the picture in some ways, okay, from the planetary science point of view. If the sample return mission from Phobos is a success, that'll be incredibly important. So what we're doing now is trying to work with the developing scientific communities. Europe and Japan have very well-developed scientific communities. We interact with them a lot just on a normal basis. What we're focusing on is India and China. Because these communities are like the Russian community was in the past, okay? They're in great need of interaction with other countries. They have people who are totally motivated, but just don't know a lot and don't have connections. So we've had Indian scientists in our lab for the last couple of years. One of them spent a year, others spend months. Carly Peters, my colleague at Brown, and I, it's her experiment. We've flown a NASA paid-for experiment on an Indian spacecraft to the moon. So we're doing international cooperation. NASA paid for it. JPL built it, and we flew it on this mission and interacted with the Indians. We're also meeting with the Chinese a lot. They have a really well-developed community, and of course you probably know they're going to be sending humans to the moon in the not-too-distant future. Not humans. I mean, I'm sorry, not generic humans. They're going to send Chinese to the moon. Our Chinese representative at the last MicroSymposium said, and then Chinese will walk on the moon. That's the way it's going to be. So what is the role of Brown Planetary Geosciences here? I think, you know, from my point of view as a teacher and somebody who is trying to develop the scientific community in this general planetology area, I think we've done a reasonable job with the Russians. We've learned a lot from them. I hope that it gets new life with maybe evolving awareness on the part of the Russian government of today that what an important contribution this is to the future of the country. But I'm not really optimistic with the present administration. I think that the future lies with India and China. Europe and Japan are definitely on the map, but watching China and Japan, particularly China, this is where things are really going to happen. And so we're helping them develop their scientific community as well, because I think, again, as with the Soviet system, the more interaction you have, the better off you are. So I thank you very much, and I apologize for going on so long here. I just get too enthusiastic. They have a bell at Brown that rings after 50 minutes, and probably should have done that. But thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. That was excellent. I think we have time for a couple of questions.
I'm happy. I just don't want to hold people up. I apologize. So. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could give us a little insight as to what you're doing with China.
Well, we're just starting, actually. You know, they're a bit like the Soviet. You might wonder why this would be the case. They're a bit like the Soviet system in the sense they have a huge Academy of Sciences, so they're very well funded, very well supported, but they're not practicing planetary science because they haven't had any data. And so at this meeting we had about 10 Chinese scientists, and so what we've been trying to do is to have some of them come. We actually had a Chinese scientist a couple of years ago who actually stayed in the U.S., and what we're trying to do is encourage them to have these kind of symposia. Okay, so we're at the very beginning stages of kind of like navigating their system, because it isn't the same as one single institute like Vernadsky and Iki. They're spread all over the place, and so and the Chinese NASA is not the kind of open NASA that we have. So what we're doing now is navigating the waters, and we've talked to, I think, about a half a dozen Chinese scientists from different institutes at this meeting and been invited to come there. So it's in the very early days, and I'm going to try to figure out, you know, what we can do to help them, because that'll help us immensely from a scientific point of view. Yes.
But us to remind you about the special wine.
Oh, the special wine. Sorry, yes, that was when the chicken was looking pretty bad, and we got a bottle of Azerbaijani wine, so we were sitting pouring it. I was pouring a little bit in everybody's glass, and I poured the last in my glass, and I looked in my glass, and there was a cockroach, and so this is just another indication of how. And you know how bad it was? It was so hard to get wine. This is also during a period of time when Gorbachev was cutting down on drinking. Okay, so. There was such a precious bottle of wine that we just took a napkin and poured all the wine through that back into the glass and went on with our toast. So anyway, it had more. It was better in context. I'm sorry, pretty gross. Yeah. Yes.
There's still some Cold War ideas about China around Washington, regardless of which administration. See any of that? Is that an issue? Is there any parallels to draw?
You know, we haven't done, I would say at this point, we haven't done the legwork to know what we want to do to go talk to them about it. So I haven't done the tour, okay, yet, but intend to, as soon as we get a little better idea of which institutes and, you know, have something to talk about. I think depending on where you go, Well, we know from the point of view of some of the dealings of NASA that there wasn't a completely open view about interacting with China from the human point of view. And yeah, so I don't have a very good answer for that, but I'm aware of the parallels, and I think I just need to get a little more data before I do the rounds, and I'm sure at that time I'll find out. Maybe, and I believe I'll come to you to help me with that, by the way.
Great story of 35 years of successful diplomacy. I think I would subtitle this. I'm just wondering, we didn't talk much about scientific results, but you've got a lot to offer to groups, agencies that are trying to successfully create avenues of communication with foreign nationals. I just wondered if you'd ever gotten into teaching any of that sort of stuff.
Not really, no. I mean, we have a center, the Center for Foreign Policy, and the Watson Institute now of International Relations. So sometimes we talk a little bit about that, but not formally, no. But the scientific results have been really incredible. I mean, they've just been incredible. And
wouldn't have been possible without.
Well, something would have happened, but I think from our point of view at Brown, it's gold. And I want to thank you all, because all of this, as Neil will tell you, is your tax dollars at work, okay? Most people tell me, I have a vested interest here, say that they really appreciate when their tax dollars go to NASA and the National Science Foundation, et cetera, because they know the money is well spent. But I want to thank you all for that too, because that's what I tell my students all the time. You need to be able to explain to people exactly what you're doing in words they can understand, because they're paying for it. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jim.
You're certainly welcome.
Outstanding evening.